Morning. Today's shir in Rambam continues with the laws of Tzedaka, Hilchas Tzedaka. Yesterday was Perek Zayin. The last Perek of yesterday was Perek Zayin of Hilchas Matnot Aniyim, where the Rambam introduces mitzvah aseh litin tzedaka laniyim. There's a mitzvah aseh, a positive mitzvah to give tzedaka to poor people. Today, in Perek Tes and Yud, he concludes. Ha'ara ba'alma, just a comment that I want to share, which I'm not sure how correct it is. Perhaps the Lamdim who are listening to this year can comment. I believe the Rambam is the first person to codify all halachas in the Tzedaka. After the Rambam came the Tur, the Shulchan Aruch, etc., and other Rishonim, the Chinuch. Of course, various people who codified the Rosh, but the Rambam was one of the first. You would think that tzedakah is more of an emotional mitzvah, and indeed, in many places in Rambam, the Rambam talks about the chiyuv of not letting poor people or widows, etc., and Hilchos Yom Tov and Hilchos Sukkah. It's interesting that the Rambam treats the mitzvah of tzedakah in an intellectual way, not in an emotional way. In other words, he doesn't feed on our emotions. He takes it very serious. Indeed, I heard from an Adam Gadol that most people think, I heard this many years ago, and it's very correct. Most people think that by not learning Hilchas Tzedakah, they will cause themselves, by learning Hilchas Tzedakah, they will cause themselves to be more lenient in Tzedakah. They'll be more giving, but the opposite is true. When one learns the laws of Tzedakah, one realizes how serious it is. Today we're going to touch upon halacha in a halachic aspect of something very relevant in the laws of tzedakah. And we'll start with the Gemara, and then we'll get to the Shittas Rambam, because there's many Shittas, many opinions in the Rishonim on how to understand the halacha. And of course, the Rambam is unique. Interestingly enough, the Shulchan Aruch passes like the Rambam, as we will see in a minute. So the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah brings down on Dav Vav Amud Aleph, there's a brisa that talks about a person has an obligation to fulfill his neder. Interestingly, our shiurim the last few weeks have been focusing on kind of the same subjects, even though it's been in different laws, Nedarim, Erech, and not Tzedakah. So the Gemara says as follows in Dav Vav Amud Beis, Tanu Rabbanan, Moitzas Vasecha, whatever comes out of your mouth, Zumitzas Aseh. Tishmer, Zumitzas Leisaseh. B'ficha tzedakah. Amar Rava. Rava says, so in other words, Moitzas Vasecha is a positive mitzvah, etc. Amar Rava says Rava, Tzedakah mechayev aleh la'alter. When a person obligates himself, to give charity, he has an obligation to give it immediately, and meaning he violates a prohibition if he doesn't. My timer. What's the reason? Says the Gemara. The Hakayim Aniyim. There are poor people waiting for the tzedakah that you decided or that you promised to give. So the Gemara asks, Pshita, this is for sure. If a person obligates himself to give tzedakah and there's a poor person waiting, of course you have to give it. So the Gemara answer is very interesting. We would think, when it comes to a sacrifice, when it comes to karbanis, the same thing. A person obligates himself to give a karban. Ksiva ad avli Allah shalish karbanis. A person only violates the prohibition of leisa acher l'shalmei balta acher, not to be delayed only after three yamim tovim. So kamash malan, that's not. It's different. The karban, you have actually three yamim tovim, roughly a year and a half. There's a big machlekes we'll see in a second to bring your karban, but it's tzedakah, says the Gemara, that Rava says you have to do it right away. Interestingly, the Gemara, there's another Gemara, there's a stira, there's a contradiction. The Rishonim ask, seemingly in that the Gemara asks that there's a contradiction between another Gemara, that the Gemara two dafim earlier seems to say differently, and the Gemara tries to explain the Rishonim try to explain what the difference is. So what does this mean? Give me 1 second. So in other words, the Gemara, we just explained the Gemara in Dabav Mebez, excuse me, how there's an obligation to give it right away. Two pages before that, on Dav Daled Amid Beis in Rosh Hashanah, the Gemara says clearly what seems to be a contradictory statement. Tana Rabbanon Chayvit Stakis Kivin Sha'av Roleim Shleisha Regalim Oiver Valtiacha. A person is obligated to give tzedakah as the minute or as it goes by 3 Yomim Tovim, he violates. So this is a clear contradiction between the Gemara in Vav Amid Beis and the Gemara in Daled Amid Beis. Vav Amid Beis, it says tzedakah mechayv leila alter, he's obligated himself right away, and the Gemara in Daled Amid Beis says only when it passes 3 Yomim Tovim. So there's many Rishonim who try to answer and to avoid the conflict between these two Gemaras. We're not going to go into each of them. If time doesn't permit. We'll just say the few relevant ones and a few ones that are easy or more palatable. Tosfos on the Daled Amid Aleph answers simply. He says there's a difference between Kaimi Aniyim when there's Aniyim that obligates a person to do it right away, and when there's no late Kaimi Aniyim, when there's no poor people, so you don't have to give it right away. There's no poor people, but if the Torah says that if 3 holidays, 3 regalim went by, and by that time you should have found an ani to give. You should have found somebody to give your tzedakah to, and if you didn't, you're violating. So Tosfos answers a very balabatish answer: the difference between whether there are poor people, aren't poor people, etc. The Rashba gets a little technical. We're not going to spend time on it. The Rashba says that there's a difference between a violation of a lav and a violation of an asay. We'll leave that for some other time when we have more time. The Ran answers something very interesting, and that's a little bit more getting closer to the shir today, to the Rambam. The Ran says something very interesting. When the Gemara says in Dav Daled Amid Beis that a person has to give, a person is donates or makes a vow to give something to charity, and he only violates the lav, the prohibition of Bal Ta'achar, not to be late, only after 3 holidays, 3 Yomim Tovim. And let me just mention something very interesting. Machlekes, the Gemara talks about how you calculate the 3 holidays. One opinion in the Mishnah says that it always starts from Pesach. So let's say you donate, you make the vow on before Shavuos, the 3 holidays start only next Pesach. So you have 5 holidays. Another opinion says the first 3 holidays. So it's an interesting machlekes in and of itself. But the Ran says when the Gemara in Dav Daled says a person is only violates the prohibition of Bal Ta'achar, not to be late, only when that tzedakah, when that charity is connected to something in the Beis Hamikdash. Since we know that the violation of three holidays is connected to Karbanis, and Karbanis sacrifices is only in the Beis Hamikdash. So too says the Ran, what the Gemara really means when it says that on tzedakah you violate Bal Ta'achar after 3 holidays, a tzedakah, a type of charity that is connected to the Beis Hamikdash, whether it's Bedek Habayis, for the upkeep of the Beis Hamikdash, or some other donation, but not a regular charity. And therefore, it does make a difference. We're not talking about Kaimi Aniyim, Lei Kaimi Aniyim. It's the type of charity that you donated to. And actually, this is how the Rambam also seems to learn. The Rambam, in other words, the Rambam says clearly in Matnot Aniyim, which is in this week's in today's shir, Perik Shmini Halacha Aleph, Tzedaka Harehi B'chlal Hanidarim. Tzedaka is included in neder. In other words, Tzedaka, says the Rambam. He's not unique in this. Tzedaka, says the Rambam, is not merely a positive mitzvah. There is a positive mitzvah to give a certain amount of tzedaka a year, and if you don't give that amount, you violate the mitzvah of giving tzedakah, etc., etc. But tzedakah in general is included in the realm of vows, of nidarim. So therefore, says the Rambam, Leficha, Cha'omer harei alai sel el tzedakah. First time he says, I'm going to give $10 to tzedakah. Oy, harei sel el tzedakah. This $10 is going to tzedakah. Chayev litna laniyim miyad. A person has an obligation to give it right away to aniyim. And if he's late, he violates the prohibition of not to delay, not to tarry in giving tzedakah. Because the person has the money, he has this $10. Unfortunately, we live in a society that there are poor people. There's no such thing that there aren't poor people. However, if there aren't poor people, he puts it away, puts it in a pushka, puts it on his account until he has aniyim. If a person made a condition, I'm making a neder to give $10 tzedakah, $1,000 tzedakah, but I will give it only when I find a ani. He doesn't have to put it on the side. And the commentaries, we'll see in a minute, have an additional caveat, an additional heter. So in the few seconds that we remain in this, so basically we have many shittas on how to resolve the issue. The Rambam seems to indicate from other places that when it comes to other types of nidarim in that we could call tzedakah, as it relates to the Beis Hamikdash, that is when he has 3 months, three holidays. But when it comes to a regular tzedakah that is given to a poor person to buy food or to eat for his house, etc., that he has to give miyad. So this is like the Ran, and this is how we can answer the two Gemaras. The one Gemara in Bava Medeis that says he has 3 regalim, and one Gemara that says miyad. It's 2 different types of vows to charity. A charity that's connected to the Beis Hamikdash. Some people say in today's day and age, the shul, the synagogue, is also is similar to this because it's a mikdash ma'at. And when it comes to a poor person, to charity that he gives to a poor person, he has to do it right away. So the Yereim, which is a very important, and by the way, let me just conclude that the halacha, the Shulchan Aruch in Yeridei Hilchos Tzedakah, Simin Reish Nun Zayin, paskins like the Rambam and the Ran, then if a person obligates himself to give tzedakah and he doesn't give, he is immediately violating the law of Baal Ta'acher. Only by Kabbanis does he have the option of waiting 3 months, and the Rama wants to add a little bit. The Rama wants to say that if a person obligates himself to give tzedakah to the synagogue, to the Beis HaKnesses, the only time when he is violating his obligation is if the Gabbai comes and asks him for the money. The Gabbai says, "Listen, you made a vow last week Shabbos to give $1,000. We really need the money. Please give it." And he doesn't give it. That's when he violates. But he himself doesn't have to run and give it. And the Mefarshim explained that if the Gabbai doesn't know, he has to tell him and leave it up to the Gabbai. Okay, so I just want to share with you a cute point brought down in a very, very lumdish sefer, an unexpected source for a story. The sefer that is called Dvar Avram. The author of the sefer was Harav Avram Duber Kana Shapiro. It's a highly lumdish sefer. Those of us that are familiar, Baruch Hashem, with Likutei Sichos are familiar with the Dvar Avram from a few places. One of the places that sticks out in memory is regarding Svek Seika, Sfir Saimer, that Rebbe brings down at Dvar Avram. It's a chashuv sefer. It's a very strong lumdish sefer, and he brings down a interesting story that you wouldn't expect in a sefer of the caliber of Dvar Avram. The Dvar Avram he brings down. It's actually in Chelik Beis, Simon Beis, in a footnote. He says a shmua that he heard from the Chafetz Chaim. And he writes over there, of course, he was a contemporary of the Chafetz Chaim. He writes that he wants to mention something that he heard in the name of Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen. And he writes that if somebody has a guest at his house Friday night, and he brings home a poor person, in those days, even before the war, not so long ago, in the 30s and the 20s, a poor person was hungry. There's a good chance he didn't eat anything that day. So he's an ani, and he needs. Today we have guests Friday night that they're not aniyim. We want to bring them closer to Torah mitzvahs. But there are people that even today that need to eat. So he said, the Dvar Avram writes that he heard a story in the name of the Chafetz Chaim that when a person brings a poor person home to eat Friday night, he shouldn't say Sholom Aleichem or Eishes Chayil or Zmiris. He should go straight to Kiddush and straight to give him food. Why? Because of this Rambam, that when a person brings somebody to his house, it's almost like a neder to tzedaka, and a neder to tzedaka, you have to do it miyad. And miyad means miyad. Miyad means immediately. And the Dvar Avram writes, no, it's a ha'arim nifla. It's a wonderful comment. He says, but we don't see that anybody is careful in this. We don't see that when a person brings a poor person to his house Friday night, he skips the Sholom Aleichem, he skips the Eishes Chayil, he skips praising his wife, and he goes straight to the gefilte fish. So he answers a little bit like this. So he answers, which is kind of obvious, I would say. It's a umdana demuchach. It's a given. It's a given that if a person brings an ani for a Seder Shabbos, so what's the gather? The gather is that the poor person, will eat when he eats, and so therefore there's another halacha. If the Chafetz Chaim is using halachas to decide when the time for eating is, he'll use another halacha. The Rambam says, and the Gemara says, kevei azman litzedaka. If somebody says, I'm going to give money to tzedaka, but I'm going to give it in 6 months. I'm going to give it right before tax season, whatever it is. I'm going to give it, so that's fine. That if he's kevei azman litzedaka, because he's not Abraham Bal Tacha. So the same way, when a person says the Dvar Avram, when a person brings an ani to his house, he's basically relying on the fact that everybody knows. You say Sholom Aleichem, and you sing, and you take achanis, and you wash the cup, and you bench the children, etc., etc. So it's not something that he violates. And another reason that another reason he says also because everybody understands that that the ani also accepted upon himself, and the another reason is because the only time there is a shita, even in this Rambam that we're learning today, that the only time you violate the violation of miyad is if you say it clearly. You're noider. The lashon of the Rambam is hanoider litzedaka, hatzedaka, ha'omer harei alai tzedaka. So when a person invites an ani, he doesn't tell the ani, I accept upon myself to give you food. He says, come to my house. Come to my house. Doesn't come join me for the Suda. So he's not saying it clearly. The Dvar Avram, I believe that Dvar Avram writes it over there to be matzdik the people that don't do it or that don't follow the Chafetz Chaim. Another issue that would be nice to talk about if we had more time was again based on this Rambam, and amazingly the Shulchan Aruch paskins like this, that a person is obligated to give miyad. Today there's a big concept, especially in the United States, about foundations, where a person donates money to a charity, to his own charity, and he creates a foundation. And there has to be a certain minimum amount of money staying in the account or staying in the foundation in order to be considered a foundation for tax purposes. And he's only allowed to give charity from the foundation a certain percentage of the foundation. So the question the Poskim were asked is, how does this jive, or how do we reconcile this with the chiyuv to give miyad? Of course, kaim yanim, there are many poor people, and they resolve it in many ways, some of which we've mentioned before. It's kind of like kevei azman. Have a nice day.